Welcome everyone to the first webinar for the Working Group 3 process at the UN Commission on International Trade, or UNCITRAL. My name is Malcolm Langford, Professor at the University of Oslo with the Pluricourt Centre of Excellence, and I also chair the ISDS Academic Forum, which is following the Working Group 3 process. Today, I will be your technical moderator and help with the process of this online meeting. Back in January, when we introduced this in Vienna, few had used Zoom, but due to the corona situation and the many lockdowns, every one of you, I'm sure, is now an expert in Zoom. However, it's important to begin with a few basics about Zoom, so we're all on the same page. Firstly, remember to mute yourself, and you can mute yourself by clicking on the mute button in the bottom left-hand corner. This means that anything that's happening at home with children or pets won't be broadcast to everybody. However, if you want to make a brief intervention, you can easily unmute yourself by pressing the space bar down, and when you lift off the space bar, you'll be muted again. Secondly, if you want to ask questions when we have question time, you can put up your hand digitally, and you digitally put up your hand in the participants button, by clicking the participants button and raise your hand, and then I will see you. Alternatively, you can write in the chat function your question, and the chat function is to the right-hand side of the participants button. Thirdly, this meeting will be recorded so that everybody will have the benefit of the wisdom of the presenters and state delegates and discussion. But if you wish not to show your face, then you can just ask the question in chat, or you can also turn your video off if it's just about the visuals. If you are worried about your background, you don't want to show what is behind you, perhaps you're sitting at home, you can also use the virtual background function, which is next to the stop video button, or the start video button. You can choose that virtual background and use another background to be a little bit more discreet. That's all from me. If you have any technical questions, just write to me on the chat or write to everybody. And we'll now start the formal seminar, which today will concern the establishment of an advisory centre, which has been a key topic at Working Group 3. The Secretary of UNCITRAL, Ana Juben Brett, cannot be with us today, but Jose Angulo Estrella Faria will take her place. He's a Principal Legal Officer and Head of the Legislative Branch at UNCITRAL, and will formally open this webinar. Thank you, Jose.
Thank you very much, Malcolm, and welcome to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. Anna would have liked to be with you, but she's been prevented for personal and family reasons.
Sorry. Continue. Jose, unfortunately, you were muted. If you could just begin again.
Okay. Again, Anna Juben Brett, the Secretary of UNCITRAL, is prevented from joining you. She would have liked to be with you today, so she gives me the honor to open the meeting on her behalf and convey to you our best wishes for a successful meeting. I am the head of the Legislative Branch, UNCITRAL Secretariat. As you probably know, this is the first, and as Malcolm has mentioned, the first webinar that we organize. It is, of course, open to all member states and participants in the Working Group 3 deliberations, but it remains an informal setting. We will not be making any formal decisions here, but it serves us to exchange.
Yes.
So we have somebody who keeps on taking off their mute button. If you could just maintain your mute button. Continue,
well,
Jose.
someone is muting me, yeah.
Just continue.
This follows the deliberations at the 38th session of the working group, where the working group had an initial discussion on this topic. And we're looking forward to the exchange of views and ideas that will come out of this. As Malcolm indicated, the webinar has been recorded and will be posted on our website. I understand that some of the participants are French-speaking, would have wished to have the webinar in bilingual. Unfortunately, we're not able to offer that at the current stage because the United Nations still do not have possess the technology and the connection that will be necessary for ensuring a fully bilingual webinar. However, the chat will be translated, so we'll be able to communicate in the chat in French or in English, and you get a French translation through the chat, as well as the PowerPoint presentations have also been translated into French. Please consult our website regularly, because this is where our information is posted about all events of this nature that will be convening to try to make up and not lose the momentum that unfortunately were lost through the cancellation and the postponement of the New York meeting. And now, Malcolm, if I may, I simply like to address a few words in French to the French-speaking colleagues that are joining us. Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour. Je vous donne la bienvenue à ce webinaire de la part de Madame Anna Joubin-Brett, la secrétaire de la communauté. Elle aurait souhaité être avec vous elle-même. Elle n'est malheureusement pas en mesure de le faire. Elle me demande de la représenter, de vous transmettre ses vœux pour de consultations et des discussions fructueuses et éclaircissantes pour le travail du groupe 3. Nous aurions souhaité pouvoir vous proposer un webinaire bilingue, anglais-français. Malheureusement, aux Nations Unies, nous ne disposons pas encore du logiciel et de l'équipement qui aurait été nécessaire pour le faire. Mes collègues du secrétariat assureront au moins une traduction de communications écrites bilinguement anglais-français. Donc, ceux parmi vous qui souhaiteraient poser une question en français peuvent le faire par une correspondance directe. Je vous souhaite de bonnes discussions. Je vous rappelle que ces discussions sont de nature informelle. Elles servent évidemment à informer le secrétariat et stimuler le travaux du secrétariat suite aux délibérations du groupe de travail à la 38e séance, mais elles restent de nature essentiellement informelle, donc il n'y aura pas de décision prise par le groupe de travail en tant que tel. Donc, bonne discussion. Je suis sûr que cela sera très utile pour la poursuite des travaux du groupe de travail. And with that, Marco, I thank you again very much for hosting this webinar, which is the first but not the last one. As one says in French, to some things, sometimes the malheur is good. In this case, it's also pushing the United Nations to try to use new technologies and other means for keeping us connected with all that. I see also that our chairman has joined us. Hello, Shane. And with that, I leave you in the good hands of our moderator and our chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish you all a very successful webinar. Thank you.
Merci bien, Jose. Thank you very much for those kind words of welcome. And I now give the word to the chairperson of Working Group 3, Shane Spilisi.
Thank you very much, Malcolm and Jose. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And to those joining us where it is either very, very late or very early, certainly thank you. As was mentioned, this is a new world for us, and I appreciate everyone working with the technology to join us for this webinar, and hope that everyone was able to do so easily. I note that this is one of 2 webinars this week as we try to move our work forward in the absence of official meetings. Et je voudrais reconnaître que l'un des défis que nous devons faire face à ce moment est le manque de toute l'assistance dont nous pouvons obtenir pendant les réunions aux Nations Unies. Et par exemple, il est plus important d'être rédacteur. Pour tous les délégats distingués qui parlent une langue à part d'anglais, je voudrais vous offrir mes excuses parce que je parlerai en anglais aujourd'hui. En absence de la traduction, je comprends bien les difficultés pour beaucoup de délégations et je prends le temps pour vous remercier pour vos efforts et aussi votre participation aujourd'hui. Distinguished delegates, you will recall that even before the current crisis, which has prevented us from meeting in person, we had discussions about using technology to facilitate our work. And we set some guidelines, which I think are worth repeating here in light of our 2 webinars this week. The sole purpose of these gatherings is to enhance the efficient and effective use of working group meeting time when we have that time again in the future. No final decisions can be taken here, and any work done today or Thursday is without prejudice to the outcome of discussions in formal meetings of the working group. So with that setting of the stage, I have been asked to give a very brief summary of where we are in our work on the question this morning, the Advisory Center. We had our first initial phase 3 discussions of the possible development of an advisory center back in October of 2019. And it was clear then that there was support for the development of an advisory center as a possible reform option to be further considered. Many delegations, particularly from least developed and developing countries, emphasized that the development of an advisory center was essential from their perspective. In terms of furthering our thinking on this subject, we identified a number of questions or issues for future consideration. And I thought in order to introduce our work in this webinar, I would simply identify what those were. I don't expect that all of them will be covered today, but hopefully we can begin our thinking in this regard. First, with respect to possible beneficiaries of an advisory center, we highlighted that future work would have to consider how an advisory center could prioritize certain types of work based on the level of development of a state, and perhaps how a sliding scale of services could be implemented. And we also identified the need for further information on possible conflicts of interest that might be created with respect to the possible provision of certain of the contemplated advisory center services to investors. Second, with respect to what services might be available, we identified the need for work with other organizations to understand what assistance might be out there already and to determine where the gaps are. We also highlighted the need for consideration of capacity building tools, such as the training of government officials, knowledge sharing tools, and general data collection and centralized repository services. And in terms of potential advocacy on behalf of clients, we were looking for further facts to understand what the burdens of such advocacy work could be and the options for such services to be provided, if at all, only based on certain criteria, such as the level of development or on some sort of exceptional basis. A third set of questions and issues we raised related to the operation of an advisory center. There was a feeling that, at least with respect to funding, such discussions would be more appropriate when there was further clarity as to the services that would be provided. But in addition to funding, other questions related to operations that we raised and would require future work included how to create a code of conduct for the advisory center, issues of professional responsibility and liability, how the center could be staffed, and the ways that it could be structured to keep costs low, but still provide capacity building in regions around the world. So as I said, those are the questions that we left ourselves with for future work at the end of our session in October. And with that brief introduction, I will simply turn it back to our moderator, Malcolm, so that we can actually let the exploration of at least some of those begin today. Thank you and merci.
Thank you very much, Shane, for those opening words, setting out the territory, which we're going to explore in the next 2 hours. We have 2 speakers who are going to present research on the Advisory Centre. But before we move to that, can I note that I've pasted the link for the meeting in the chat, both the formal one using Bit, but also the direct Zoom link. So if you have colleagues who are struggling to get into the meeting, you can just send them those links, which I've posted in the Zoom chat. But it seems most people are now in the meeting. We're going to start with Carl Savant from the University of Columbia in the United States, who has written a paper for the Academic Forum on the establishment of an advisory center. So the word is yours, Carl.
Thank you very much, Mal, and good day, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak about the main aspects to be considered in the establishment of an advisory center on international investment law. My remarks complement the excellent Secretariat document on the same subject prepared last year for Working Group 3. More specifically, I'd like to speak briefly about why an advisory center is needed, and then turn to the questions of beneficiaries, the services an advisory center could provide, its governance, and finally the question of financing such a center. In other words, some of the questions that Shane mentioned a moment ago. Given the limited time I have, I will not be able to go into much detail, but perhaps we can return to some points during the discussion period of the webinar. So let me first talk briefly about the need for a center. We know that the number of ISDS cases has passed the 1,000 mark, and we also know that the potential for many more cases is very high. Among other things, because the number of international investors is very high, well over 100,000. The number of foreign affiliates is very high, well over 1 million, and many of the 3,000 plus international investment agreements contain ISDS clauses. At the same time, we also know that there are many under-resourced developing countries that neither have the human resources to defend themselves adequately in international investment disputes, nor do these countries have the funds to hire international law firms to do so. Hence, establishing an advisory center on international investment law would be very desirable to assist developing countries in ISDS disputes. It could be an independent intergovernmental institution patterned on the Advisory Center on WTO law. Establishing such a center would level the playing field and provide de facto access to justice to under-resourced developing countries. It would improve the current international investment regime and, with that, strengthen its legitimacy, something that is very desirable given the criticism that the investment regime faces from various quarters. Let me now turn to the potential beneficiaries. In my opinion, the beneficiaries should only be developing countries that are members of an advisory center, using as the principal criterion that respondent governments should be under-resourced. The level of income of countries could be taken into account, including by granting special conditions to least developed countries. Let me mention one additional thought in the context of talking about beneficiaries. If states face disputes only from time to time, the opportunity costs of building up highly competent in-house legal capacity to deal with ISDS cases may not be attractive. This makes access to an advisory center even more important. This brings me immediately to my second point, namely the scope of work of an advisory center on international investment law. This is a very important issue because the broader the scope of work of a center, the higher its budget needs to be, and the more difficult it would become to raise finance for the center. Hence, I suggest that the core competency of an advisory center should be to represent, together with lawyers from respondent states, under-resourced developing countries in international investment disputes and the immediate preparation of such disputes. There are three reasons for a focus on representation. First, while technical assistance is required across a wide range of issues related to the international investment regime, such assistance is available in a number of areas from both intergovernmental organizations and other institutions, as amply documented in the scoping study prepared by CCSI for the government of the Netherlands. An example concerns trainings about issues that are addressed in international investment agreements. Such trainings are offered by various governmental and non-governmental institutions. In fact, it would be desirable to avoid duplication of work. Second reason for a focus on representation is, and that is very important, that there is currently no institution that provides substantial assistance in the representation of respondents in international investment disputes. Developing countries are virtually entirely left on their own if and when they face disputes, with the limited exception of the African Legal Support Facility. In other words, there is a real gap in the international investment regime that needs to be filled. And the third reason for which I suggest that the core competency of an advisory center should be to help developing countries to defend themselves adequately in international investment disputes is that, as we all know, conducting such disputes is already very costly. Adding additional responsibilities to the mandate of a center, such as general technical assistance related to IIAs, might risk overloading the center's mandate and therefore might risk making the establishment of such a center so expensive that the funds cannot be raised to bring it into existence. Of course, nothing would prevent states from extending the mandate of the center to technical assistance in general once it is up and running, so to speak, in the light of experience gained. In sum, determining the scope of the mandate of the center is a very important question. You should take into account that it is desirable to avoid overlap with the work of other institutions. It should focus on where there is a real gap in the international investment regime, namely representation. And it should not be overambitious, but rather take a gradual approach, expanding its as experience is gained. Perhaps it should be guided, perhaps the determination of the mandate should be guided by the thought that the best can be the enemy of the good. Let me now turn to the question of governance. I can be very brief here because, in my opinion, one could simply follow the model of the Advisory Center on WTO law. In other words, an advisory center on international investment law could be open to all countries. It could have a general assembly consisting of representatives of its members and beneficiaries, and a management board could guide the center's operation. An executive director could manage the center's day-to-day activities, supported by a dedicated staff who is respected and trusted by beneficiary respondents. The center staff could be easily complemented by government lawyers from developing countries joining the center on secondment. This would help build knowledge in the governments concerned and, in this manner, build capacity. This would be a service not offered elsewhere. Finally, the question of finance. Naturally, this is a very important issue because, obviously, without raising the required finance, there will not be an advisory center. As already mentioned, this is one of the reasons why it is not desirable to be overambitious when it comes to the center's mandate. Representing respondents is already costly enough. There are various sources of finance one could consider, but most likely the single most important source would consist of official development assistance provided by countries that are in a position to provide the required funds. What amounts are required to establish a center? We know that the budget of the Advisory Center on WTO law was almost 5 million in 2019. The ACWL has 12 professional staff and had in 2019 16 active cases. Plus, its staff also provides legal opinions and some training. An advisory center on international investment law would most likely require a higher budget, but I cannot give you a figure right now. Hopefully, however, we'll be able to provide an estimate in the not too distant future as a small IAI working group is examining the matter. Underlying the important question of how to finance a center is the consideration that a well-functioning and broadly accepted international investment regime is in the interest of states and investors. Let me come to the end of my remarks. In summary, I think there is a distinct need for establishing an advisory center on international investment law. It should have a clear focus on helping under-resourced developing countries in defending themselves adequately in international investment disputes. Its governance could follow that of the ACWL, and its financing would have to come largely from official development assistance. Establishing an advisory center would close a real gap in the investment regime. It would level the playing field for under-resourced developing countries, thus providing them with de facto access to justice and it would strengthen the legitimacy of the international investment regime. By way of conclusion, let me congratulate the working group for addressing the issue of an advisory center in its deliberations. Maybe these deliberations could benefit from another webinar of the kind we have today to examine some of the many technical issues related to the establishment of an advisory center. And maybe, if I may be so bold to suggest it, a task force consisting of representatives of interested governments could be established to work out what could be the terms of reference for an advisory center. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Carl, for setting out clearly the issues, but also the various options and a potential way forward on them. You mentioned in your presentation a report that's been written by CCSI on behalf of the government of Netherlands, and will be presented now by CCI representative Brooke Given.
Thanks, Malcolm. All right, let me just share my screen here. All right. We good?
We're good. Go for it.
Okay, excellent. So thanks, Malcolm. Good morning, evening, afternoon to everyone. As Malcolm mentioned, I'm Brooke Guven with the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment. CCSI is a joint center of Columbia Law School and the Earth Institute at Columbia University in New York City. And we are participating as an observer organization within Working Group 3 to help support the work being done in that forum. As was mentioned, we were commissioned by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands to conduct a scoping study on securing adequate legal defense in proceedings under international investment agreements. So this presentation is intended to describe that study and our findings. All right. So the study was submitted to the Secretariat by the Netherlands, Peru, and Thailand, and it's now available on the Working Group 3 website as Working Paper 196. So the executive summary will be translated into all UN languages, and the full study is available currently in English. In this study, I should note we use the term assistance mechanism rather than advisory center to indicate that there are a wide variety of models that could be developed, and that each of these models tends to achieve different objectives and address different challenges. So we set forth many of them to consider for the working group to consider. The study does not advocate for a specific model of mechanism, but sets forth issues, evidence, lessons learned, and a variety of potential solutions that could be developed to respond to different kinds of capacity challenges. The approach we took in the scoping study was to conduct desk-based research, as well as interviews with government officials, individuals who have worked for or are working for various assistance mechanisms, individuals who work with arbitral institutions, academics, private practitioners, civil society, and private sector multinational corporations. The interviewees were each asked to share their experiences and ideas relating to their capacity challenges and how an assistance mechanism could or should address them. The issues that we set forth in the scoping study include discussions of capacity challenges that were articulated to us during our consultations. We described previous attempts to establish an international investment law advisory center. We consider various models of assistance mechanisms that might be considered in this context. We address in depth some cross-cutting issues that emerged that are important for policymakers to consider regardless of the model selected. And then we also address the particular issues faced by investors, namely SMEs. And this presentation will roughly follow that order. Due to the time, I will of course be rather brief, but I direct everyone to the scoping study for further information. The Consultations we conducted revealed that concerns about participation in the investment law system are much more fundamental than only its financial costs, although that concern is also quite significant. Based on our consultations, we consider in depth the different kinds of challenges that states experience in each of the phases of investment law that are listed on the screen. It also considers whether and to what extent existing assistance mechanisms are already filling certain capacity gaps and describes what activities they're engaged in. So for example, in investment policymaking, states struggle to effectively engage in the many fora in which investment policy issues are being discussed and advanced. So these can include UNCTAD, the OECD, UNCITRAL, the context of financing for development, investment facilitation discussions in the WTO, and regional organizations. The hurdles, though, are not limited to financial and human resources, but also include cross-governmental strategies and communication at the domestic level. So the study then will go on to describe the different work that existing mechanisms are doing in this area. So in this context, that's UNCTAD, the OECD, the World Bank, and various others. By comparison, other issues on this list, such as treaty negotiation, domestic implementation, dispute prevention, ongoing treaty management, and pre-dispute management, have relatively little existing support. Case staffing and the procurement of outside counsel is obviously a very large topic and is considered in depth in the scoping study. The frequency of cases against a state is perhaps one of the most, if not the most, relevant questions for understanding how states wish to staff the defense of their claims. The study discusses the different ways in which states do this, in what circumstances they wish to bring more activities in-house, and the various hurdles that they experience in doing so, and different factors driving the procurement of outside counsel. The scoping study, after addressing capacity challenges, goes on to discuss previous attempts at establishing an investment law advisory center and discusses lessons learned from these efforts. Based on the research and interviews, the broad takeaway is that one cannot underestimate large policy differences, but also small decisions, as disagreements can halt any effort, even close to the finish line. I'll now move on to discuss the potential models that an assistance mechanism could take, each of which is discussed in much greater detail in the scoping study using examples of assistance mechanisms that already exist. And I should say those are assistance mechanisms that exist both in investment law, but also other areas of law, such as criminal or human rights law. So one model that we analyze is providing institutionalized multi-service support, including legal representation. This model can include services including capacity building, negotiation support, policy advice, legal opinions, or representation in proceedings. Examples that we consider in depth in the study include the Advisory Center on WTO Law, the African Legal Support Facility, and IDLO's Investment Support Program for LDCs. And I'll speak a bit more in depth about the ACWL model, as Carl did before me, which is the only one that is structured to provide direct legal representation to government clients using its own in-house legal counsel. It has an excellent reputation in the trade field. So the ACWLs provide support in a number of ways, and some of this Carl went over. Reduce cost direct legal assistance, providing private counsel at preset rates in some contexts, free trainings, free legal opinions, secondments, and it has a fund for the use of expert witnesses. The table on this slide, which is from the report and the ACWL's annual report, illustrates the quantity and breakdown of activities. So for example, in 2018, the ACWL received 5 new requests for assistance and was handling 17 disputes at various phases. Its budget, as Carl mentioned, was around $5 million. So focusing on the dispute settlement role, the ACWL charges member users and LDCs a fee. The fee is a set hourly rate with a maximum fee cap per phase of proceeding. This table shows the fee for a panel proceeding. Each country category is based on an economic formula determined by the country's economic profile. One important consideration is whether handling WTO disputes is comparable to handling ISDS disputes, and if not, how this should inform how an investment law assistance mechanism is structured. And there are some differences that are often noted, such as the fact that the WTO is state to state. But another important question that flagged to us by an interviewee who has worked in both systems, and which we looked into, are the number and amount of resources required. And there are fundamental differences between the systems. In particular, the ACWL estimates that each case will require a set number of hours and then sets a corresponding maximum charge to users. The estimate for the number of person hours required for a WTO panel proceeding in 2018 was 444 hours. With respect to ISDS cases, we actually found that information quite difficult to obtain, as the public portion of cost submissions generally don't provide the number of attorney hours worked. We did find that data in a couple of filings listed here, both Canadian. The ISDS dispute estimated hours were roughly 20,000. And given that the cost breakdown is also roughly similar to known costs of disputes, potentially at the lower end, this seems a reasonable estimate. The ACWL acknowledges that it does work beyond these capped hours, but the difference is clearly an order of magnitude. And at this hour load, the ACWL can handle 5 new claims per year and 17 cases at different phases. We also discussed in the scoping study the financing of the ACWL in depth. The ACWL was established to be self-sustaining after a period of time, operating based on income from donor and member-funded endowment, as well as user fees. This hasn't materialized. The ACWL needed in the 2017 to 2021 budget an additional $20 million of funds. The user fees have on average represented 4% of annual revenues. I believe in 2018, that was around $161,000. Litigation occupies roughly 40 to 60% of its time. So key questions that should be asked if this model is to be considered in the context of ISDS are contained in the scoping study. Moving on, a second model that we consider is that of institutionalized multi-service support, but not including legal representation. So one that might offer services including capacity building, negotiation support, or policy advice. And examples include international organizations, arbitration centers, academic institutions, and nonprofit organizations. Another model is that of financial or in-kind support. So this model would include trust funds, such as the PCA trust fund, which is used in investment law. And this model is actually used to a much greater extent in other legal systems. And then there are third market mechanisms such as third-party funding or contingent representation. Other models that we look at in depth include pro bono or ad hoc legal support, intergovernmental knowledge sharing hubs, discrete capacity building networks, and legal assistance and resource clearinghouse, which is a place where governments might go simply to understand the range of existing services that are available to them. Then, as I mentioned, we go in depth on some cross-cutting issues that are applicable to all of the models that we discuss. And just to overview them, the quality, reliability, reputation, and trust were stated to be the key issues during our consultations. Interviewees stressed that there must be an alignment of interest between any assistance mechanism and the state, and this is included but not limited to financial interests. With respect to funding and the scope of services, it seems likely that there will be a trade-off between the depth of countries that can access services and the breadth of services that can be offered, and that both will be highly dependent on funding. With respect to cost of support and who bears it, a few models are explored, including where the service provider pays, so for example, a pro bono model, where a donor pays, which could be a development agency, or where a user pays, which would include market or reduced fees. And these models can obviously be used in combination, as is done with the ACWL. With respect to stakeholder conflicts of interest and tensions, different relationships between donors, support providers, client governments, private and government-owned investors, and other stakeholders become more or less prevalent, depending on the range of services provided by a mechanism. The question of who should benefit from an assistance mechanism services is a critical one, and one that is closely tied to the identified capacity concerns and the mechanism's objectives. The location, staffing, remuneration of a mechanism and its employees elicited many differences of opinion. The way in which one approaches these issues also depends on the role of the mechanism. For example, if a mechanism is more involved in legal representation, it may make sense to place it in a commercial hub, such as Paris or DC. But the mechanism is then far removed from government clients. There were suggestions for a mechanism that may have multiple locations with obvious cost implications. With respect to staff, there was a focus not only on diversity in staff, but also what kind of staff would be appropriate, and this is again tied to the objective of the mechanism. The long-term sustainability of a mechanism and government's ability to rely on its services were considered a key element. The degree of institutionalization of a mechanism was also raised. For example, whether a more informal networks should be given support for expansion rather than creating an entirely new mechanism. The politics surrounding the creation or expansion of an assistance mechanism are also explored. Finally, policymakers should bear in mind how the challenges that a mechanism is intended to address intersect with other reforms. For example, other efforts to reduce costs or limit claims may address some of the issues that could be the subject of an assistance mechanism. And then before I end, I just want to say we do have a section on considerations of investors as beneficiaries. Certain key issues to include or to consider include whether and to what extent states wish to include investors as beneficiaries, and if so, for all or for some or all services. If SMEs were to benefit, what definition should be used, and those are considered. Other issues relate to the nature and scope of concerns that a mechanism is intended to address, and the particular challenges of investors, which in many ways differ from the challenges states experience. And finally, consideration of the cross-cutting issues that I identified earlier as they relate to SMEs are also relevant. So thank you very much for that. I'll turn it back to you, Malcolm.
Thanks very much, Brooke, and that brings us to the end of our section with expert presentations. And now we're going to move over to a selected number of comments from state delegations on particular topics. Unfortunately, we do not have the representative from the government of Guinea with us today. Unfortunately, indisposed at the last moment. That's Silo Diallo, who was to speak on general advisory services, including on investment treaties. However, we have 4 other state delegations that will present. And the first is Ralph van der Beek, a representative from the government of Netherlands, who will comment on the legal assistance dimensions of a potential advisory centre. Thanks very much, Ralph van der.
Thank you, and good morning, afternoon, and evening to all of you. It is indeed an honor to speak after Brooke, who introduced the scoping study that we, together with Thailand and Peru, commissioned to facilitate the discussions on assistance mechanisms, of which we started our intergovernmental discussions during the 38 sessions of Working Group 3. Now, in the discussion of what type of legal assistance would be most appropriate, I think it's important to first consider the underlying issues. That is, the specific issues that participants encountered in IIA proceedings. And the scoping study clearly indicates that the concerns about international investment agreements and ISDS are broader than just the financial cost of participation in the system. Let me first mention that what I'm saying here does not prejudge any sort of position the Netherlands will take on any proposal during the UNCITRAL working group meetings. This is just a reflection that we are doing right now, also based on the study, and it is to inform the discussion. So please take these points as work in progress on our side as well. Now, as the study illustrates, there are different types of service provision possible to respond to the challenges. They range from more discrete areas to a fully fledged, robust form of support, including legal representation. And again, as Brooke mentioned, considering the variety of issues that are encountered and considering the desirability of support that matches the underlying challenges, I think we should be sensible to keep the discussion broad and consider the feasibility of any type of assistance mechanisms rather than narrowing it down right now to an advisory center at this point. Now, in the assessment of desirability and feasibility of an assistance mechanisms, we think three aspects should be given particular attention. That is, the extent to which the support responds to the particular needs, obviously, the additionality of such a mechanism, and of course, the practical implications. As for the first criterion regarding the extent to which the support responds to particular needs, we think the scoping study is a great starting point. The study is based on consultations with both states and stakeholders and thereby provides us for a solid basis. Perhaps it would be good, in as far as that is possible, to have more supporting quantitative data. Taking into account that there might not be a one-size-fits-all model, I think it would be helpful in our considerations which mechanism would receive the broadest support. So that might be something that we can dive into a bit more. In terms of the second criterion regarding additionality, we're well aware, and Brooke mentioned a couple of them, that there are several existing mechanisms that overcome or partially overcome the challenges. So any future assistance mechanism should build on that existing work and should have clear added value. The third criterion on the practical implications of establishing an assistance mechanism, as was also mentioned, there have already been several attempts to establish an advisory center, which all stranded for some or other reason. And these examples illustrate that the practicalities of the establishment of an assistance mechanism should not be underestimated. And the scoping study Brooke mentioned particularly mentions the importance of funding and the location. In terms of legal assistance, there are different types of legal assistance, ranging from discrete to more robust forms. And these discrete forms, they may include the provision of memos on particular legal issues, access to information and advice on counsel and or arbitrator selection, support on retaining and using experts, valuation and damaging, support on gathering and managing documentary evidence, etc., etc. A number of other options are outlined in the study, so I won't mention all of them, given the breadth of the study. Study also lists financial or in-kind inputs and pro bono ad hoc legal and expert support as a more substantial form of service provision. Now, the robust types of service provision are institutionalized multi-service support, potentially including legal representation of blind governments. If we apply the three criteria to the policy option to include legal assistance, I'd like to note the following. Regarding the extent to which support responds to particular needs, it seems to be there to include legal assistance, but we suggest that this merits a bit of further assistance to delineate what type of legal assistance is particularly needed. With regard to the second criteria concerning the additionality of offering legal assistance, we think that that will be met, given that most of the other existing mechanisms usually do not offer such types of services. So that's a box ticked, I would say. With regard to our third criterion on the practical implications, I'd like to note a couple of things. Generally speaking, the scope of the legal assistance is a determining factor for the practical feasibility. More discrete forms of legal assistance are easier to implement in terms of costs and location. They're cheaper, and secondly, such services may not require physical location, but could be offered online or in any other form. In regards for the more robust forms of legal assistance, particularly when we talk about legal representation, the scoping study describes, and Brooke mentioned that, existing mechanisms, among which the ACWL. And the study clearly reveals that a robust version of legal support in IAA proceedings is rather challenging compared to WTO procedures. Brooke mentioned a number of things such as cost and everything, but let me highlight just two of them that are also relevant in our discussions in the investment fields. One is location. Assuming that such a robust version of legal support requires a physical location, it should be noted that unlike in trade disputes, there's no obvious place for such a center. The WTO is based in Geneva and countries already have delegations there, but that is not, there's no such obvious center or node in the world for investment agreements. Another issue I would mention is systemic value. A very important consideration, the systemic long-term effect of such legal support. In the WTO context, there may be low case values, there may be low value cases that are still high in systemic importance. For ISDS, it may be vice versa. A state win in one ISDS case will not produce systemic gains due to the fragmented system of so many international investment agreements and its ad hoc nature. So this begs the question whether the establishment of such a robust version of legal support is justified in the current situation, where this is so fragmented. Again, there are a number of other issues that relate to this I want to mention, and also for time. It's also important to take note of possible tensions between stakeholders. There are obvious potential tensions between client governments and donor governments, including conflict of interest in outcomes and funding. Funding is a particularly sensitive issue when it comes to legal representation. Last but not least, it should be noted that for some type of expenditures, there will likely be associated economies of scale. Some services may reach a wider set of potential beneficiaries. Training may be replicated, open access to online resources and databases, etc. And in contrast, litigation support in discrete cases may not have such economies of scale. It may be uncertain whether litigation in a following case will be at a lower cost. In conclusion, I would therefore offer 3 points. One, should be further investigation what the particular needs of potential beneficiaries are, perhaps with the support of quantitative data, and based thereon what the responding assistance, legal assistance, should look like. And considering the services of the existing fora, we do think that legal assistance is likely to have added value. Thirdly, discrete form of legal assistance are probably more feasible than a robust version of legal assistance at this point. As they are cheaper, and secondly, they may not require a physical location. And also certain issues that arise in terms of legitimacy, systemic value, and impact of legal support may not be as imminent for more discrete types of legal assistance than they are for full-fledged legal representation. They're also more replicable and therefore may have a higher value in terms of economies of scale. Such an informal assistance mechanism with discrete forms of legal assistance may serve as a starting point and may be used as the interim solution building further on this, as we recognize that the more formal and more political the establishment of an assistance mechanism becomes, the more difficult it may become to achieve consensus. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ralph van der Beek from the Government of Netherlands. We'll now move on to mediation services that could be provided by an advisory centre. We'll have a presentation or comments from Charlie Ganjana Gunchorn, representative from the Government of Thailand. The word is yours. Charlie, you're unmuted now.
Hello, Malcolm, can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Hello?
Continue to speak, we can hear you. Charlie?
Yes, I'm here. And can you hear?
Now we can hear you, now we can see you. Very good.
I'm sorry, the internet drops out at the moment you're about to speak, as usual.
That's fine.
You have my slides.
Oh, you
If
can
not, okay, I can share my screen if you
You can
don't.
share your screen, yep.
Okay. Give you a moment. Hello, everyone. So good evening from Bangkok. Today, I've been asked to talk about mediation and how the advisory center could provide services on the mediation front. My job today is to spark ideas, give you questions rather than answer them, I think. And it's from my experience as a lawyer at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and from my own experience, and from information talking to other colleagues from other governments and other ministries. The first point I'd like to make is the obvious benefits of mediation. Now, mediation, it's not a usual route for governments, at least from my own experience, but mediation is very affordable. In compared, like Brooks said, in compared to what Brooks said, it's much cheaper in terms of time, in terms of lawyer hours. So it's a good option for developing countries. Mediation is flexible. For example, mediation does not leave you with the either win or lose situation. It gives you the other options as well. So for example, if it were to be an ISDS case, it gives you the investor the option of selling off their investment to a third party, which would not be otherwise available in a litigation context. Mediation can be confidential. A lot of ISDS disputes are sensitive political matters, so mediation serves that purpose well, being which it can serve as a confidential basis for dispute resolution. Mediation, if done properly, can prevent litigation as well. Or if it doesn't prevent litigation, it can shorten litigation. From my own experience, that leads to my last point. Mediation, or the attempt to mediate, sometimes focuses the government or the litigants to the real issues at hand. And sometimes the attempts to mediate cuts off the issues that can be agreed upon by the parties. So from a big dispute, mediation can narrow a dispute into a much narrower scope. So be it an OPMED procedure or even an OPMED-ARB procedure. So these are the benefits of mediation from my own perspective. Now, the practical challenges to mediation, right? And in particular, in using an advisory center for mediation. The first point that I'd like to make is the limited resources. What do I mean by that? Now, many governments, they allocate resources for dispute resolution, negotiation, and litigation. A lot of the time, mediation is not included in that package. So sometimes it does happen that the budget that's been allocated, maybe it cannot be used for this process. So we have to be careful of this. And the advisory center being, as Brooke mentioned, and Carl mentioned, a better value can help states to access the mediation process. Lack of expertise. What I mean by that is that usually the in-house lawyers of states, they are trained to be litigants, but not necessarily to take part in a mediation. Right? This is where the advisory center can come in, because a lot of lawyers, the first step they go to is to negotiate, and then the second step they jump onto straight away is the litigation. So there is this lack of expertise on how to enter the mediation process. This leads me to my third point, the hesitation to commit to the process, because mediation a lot of the time is unknown to states, to governments. It's a process which is a bit foreign to them. There is this hesitation to commit to the mediation because they're unaware or they're uncertain of what the outcome might be. So this is where the advisory center can come in and provide advice on how to enter the process and reassure states that the mediation can produce a fruitful outcome. Avoidance of responsibility. Mediation is particularly difficult for states because usually the person responsible for taking the measure that's in dispute, it's not necessarily the person who's at the mediation or the negotiation table. So if that person who's at the mediation table were to accept the mediation outcome, there is a question of whether he will be liable or responsible for what the state has to pay as damages to the investor. Now, the advisory center can come and help into this and explain how the process works. That also leads to my last point on fear and criticism. If there is a unbiased international organization, such as the advisory center, civil servants or government officials would be more likely to be able to answer to their political masters as to the appropriateness of the mediation arrangement. So as I outlined earlier, the advisory center in sum would have roles like this vis-a-vis a mediation process. First of all, they would explain how the mediation works to the government official. Right? Secondly, a problem we have had in the past as well is we do not know many mediators because first of all, we don't have many cases. And secondly, the lawyers or counsel that are known to the governments are a lot of the time not mediators, they are litigators or counsel in general. So the advisory center can play a role in this regard, and they can keep a roster of leading mediators with them, so states can have access to this list. An advisory center can even administer the mediation, including the drafting of settlement agreements. This would save a lot of cost and a lot of time for developing states. As I mentioned earlier, the value of an unbiased assessment by the advisory center would be very helpful for states to be able to quote or to refer to a perhaps international organization on the likely outcome of the dispute, how the case shape is, and to report to their political masters. And lastly, I think, and very importantly, an advisory center can provide a best practices exchange platform, because for the moment, with regard to mediation, we are left out pretty much in the cold. We don't have information from other governments easily on how they've treated mediation in the past, and that we have little guidance on how we should proceed. My last my last slide concerns important issues to consider. Now, this echoes, I think, a lot of what Carl and Brooke mentioned earlier. These questions are hanging questions which need to be answered perhaps by the working group at some stage. Now, the question for the advisory center versus the mediation process is obviously the limitation in terms of financial resources. So obviously, who would be the beneficiaries? Because the financial resources cannot extend to everyone. Would it be developing states, all states, or investors? As Carl mentioned, how would be the services be funded, right? Because obviously it cannot, the £5 million mark that was mentioned earlier, that is probably a modest figure. for an advisory center for ISDS. So that would put a limitation on the extent to which an advisory center can help on mediation. And an advisory center providing for ADR services. Obviously, that would add workload, and some would argue unconventional workload on the center, because like the ACWL, a lot of their work is advice before litigation, and a lot of their work is advice during litigation. And adding work at the mediation stage would obviously put more work on an already, what I would imagine, a very heavy load on such an advisory center. So in sum, I raised these questions for everyone to consider, and then these questions are to be discussed further. Thank you, Malcolm.
Thank you very much, Charlie. And before I give the word to the next two commentators, just to note that after they speak, we'll open up for questions and comments. And as I explained in the chat, you can write your comments or questions in the chat function to me, or you could ask everybody. Or you can raise your hand under the participants function and I'll give you the word in the order of reception. Without further ado, let's go to Charles Afeku from the African Legal Facility in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, who will speak on capacity building and sharing of best practices. Charles.
Thank you, Malcolm. Can everyone hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Thanks again, and greetings to everyone from Abidjan. I'd like to thank Anna and Jose and the team at UNCITRAL for giving the ALSF an opportunity. First of all, I've participated in the reform processes as they have evolved, and the opportunity to make this presentation. So I work, by way of introduction, I work with the ALSF as advisor to the director. In this presentation, even though it's focused, I think I need to broaden it a bit just to situate some of the things I'll say on capacity. So the objective really is to share our experience in providing legal advisory and capacity building services to our, what we call regional member countries. And hopefully this assists the working group in making informed decisions about the establishment of its own advisory center. So I'll be speaking briefly about the establishment of the ALSF, our functions, how we work, and in conclusion, a few things about our funding situation. So basically, we were established in 2008, even though we began operations in 2010. The governance structure consists of a governing council, which rotates amongst the member countries. We have a management board and a director that's responsible for the day-to-day activities. We have a staff complement of about 30. And I heard Carl talk about 600 nationals. We've just sort of put in place a policy to be able to do that. Our membership comprises the majority of African countries. We have a number of non-regional member countries, Belgium, Brazil, France, the Netherlands, and the United States, and about 7 international. The main reason we were set up was because of the HIPIC, highly indebted poor country situation in the 2000s, 2005. And the Vulture Fund litigation that sort of arose from that situation. So the African funds at the time wanted help to be able to litigate those Vulture Fund. The litigation comes from some underlying transactions, so they identified some of those, so that if you are able to provide capacity building and advice in those areas, you sort of limit the debt situations and the litigation that arises from it. So the key sectors in which we operate are extractives and natural resources, power, infrastructure and PPP, and sovereign debt. In order of demand, we basically get a lot of requests for advisory services. And what we normally do in that area is provide legal advice and negotiation support in the sectors I mentioned. For capacity building, basically, which is the second most important of our functions, or most demanded, we provide capacity building for government officials in the specific sectors as well, or even regionally, where we are able to map that the skills required are across board. We have in recent times established the the ALSF Academy, to be able to deploy virtually our capacity building. Now, this in the process, we'll have 3 levels. So we complete training, and we are also in the process of getting accreditation for the courses and the practical activities that go on over there. I should mention that dispute resolution, including arbitration, and soft skills are considered cross-cutting areas across the sectors. The other couple of things we do are knowledge management. Basically, because of the involvement in the sector, we amass a lot of data, so we try to make sense of it in a way that the countries can easily refer to for decision making and knowledge products. And this is usually helpful in our capacity building role and advisory roles. Litigation, which incidentally is what we started with when we were established, now does not involve so much of our activities. Even though this year, because of the COVID-19 situation, I think we're getting a lot of requests in that regard. Arbitration, we include in dispute resolution or litigation, but we only basically advise the countries or facilitate or support them in arbitration when we were involved in the underlying transaction. Now, the way we work is demand driven. Basically, we get a request from the country, and we conduct this due diligence process, basically trying to understand the issues and the best way to provide support to the country. We develop a project proposal in terms of reference for recruiting the law firm or the legal counsel that can assist the country. We have pre-qualified some law firms for each of the sectors, about 5 or 6 for each of them, so that makes it easy to quickly deploy the expertise that is required. And as part of capacity building, we also require, if there are international experts that have been recruited, because sometimes it's local law firms, they are required to work with local law firms to sort of further capacity building. Now, we don't pay the countries directly for these services. They play a part in the payment process, but basically to validate the work that has been done, and the payment is made directly to the lawyers or the technical experts that are provided. So far, we've mainly given grants to countries, but we've also, in recent times, come up with some financing models that include loans, especially for sectors that are productive or commercial, and success-based fee instruments. To conclude, so for the past 10 years, we've disbursed about 90 million USD, and we've worked in about 256 operations across 45 African countries. And these funds or the legal support that we have acquired using these funds have been used in a variety of things, services, including implementation agreements, Eurobond issuance, concession agreements, even developing legal frameworks to be able to support negotiations, boardroom training. There's a variety of things, and basically they are dictated by the country's needs for your attention. And I'm able to elaborate on some of the issues much later. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Charles. And last but not least, in our presentations today, we have Ricardo Ampero, a representative from the government of Peru. We'll talk about potential beneficiaries, which is a topic also raised in the earlier presentations by Carl and Brooke. The word is yours, Ricardo. And would you like me to show the PowerPoint, or would you like to share it?
Thank you very much, Malcolm. I think I can.
Very good. You're all experts now.
Yes. Good morning or good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much to the UNCITRAL Secretariat for your kind invitation to participate in the first webinar of Working Group 3. It is a pleasure to see and hear a lot of you. I hope we will soon have the chance to meet again and continue our work and discussions on such important topics. As Malcolm said, I will refer to the issue of potential beneficiaries. And I think as a previous point, I would like to note a part of the scoping study that I thought was very interesting. The scoping study focuses mainly on what it would take to have a center that truly achieves capacity building. But during the interviews that were conducted, it was noted that capacity may be a vague term. And the need for the center may be more closely related to knowledge transfer. In turn, this can only be achieved by identifying very clearly what the specific needs of the beneficiaries are. The reason I found this portion of the scoping study interesting is that I think it properly lays out that various elements of a possible center are connected, and so they can't be defined by themselves. And I think this is important to keep in mind during the discussions we are going to have about this issue, and especially regarding potential beneficiaries of an advisory center. In terms of what I think are some crucial elements regarding the definition of potential beneficiaries, and this goes back to the point that everything is connected, I think we need to look at least three main things. Number one is the scope of services the center would provide. Is it going to be litigation support or dispute management? Is it going to be only discrete legal issues relating to IAA policy? Is it going to be advisory on treaty negotiation, developing a model BIT? Is it going to be focused on dispute prevention? These are all important questions, because who is going to use these tools largely depends on what those tools are. The second main point is funding. And as it was noted, there are several options here, and each one has a wide range of implications. Do the legal service providers cover the cost? Is it only going to be pro bono work from universities or centers? Do the service users pay all or some of the costs? And how would that work? Is it going to be case by case? Is it going to be a periodic fee that they have to contribute? Or do third parties pay for the cost? And here, the scoping study lays out several important questions. If third parties are going to cover the costs, who can contribute? Is it only governments, philanthropic associations, private entities? When do they contribute? Whenever each case comes up, do they pay for each case, or do they contribute general funds? Under what terms? Do they have a say in the management of the case? Do they have a say in the direction of the advisory? These are all important questions. And finally, who the advisors are. Will it be a law firm, a different law firm secured for each case? Is it going to be internal permanent staff? I think these are all questions that we need to think about when deciding the potential beneficiaries. Once we have that, there's also a very interesting discussion as to who those beneficiaries could be. Obviously, states are clear potential beneficiaries, but even at that point, we still need to think about certain important elements. Eligibility is the decision on who gets access to the advisory center based only on the level of development? Is it going to be only for developing countries? Or should we also take a look at the characteristics of the dispute? There's also the question of entitlement. And this is going to be important because there will need to be a definition on whether the center can, for example, decline services. And if so, on what grounds? What happens if, for example, the center or the advisors have different views on the merits of the case? Another important question is, once, as we all know, when an international investment dispute first begins, there may be limited information as to what the dispute entails and how it evolves. It has happened that in the course, for example, of an arbitration, the matter has become extremely complex. What happens if the case becomes too expensive, for example? And finally, there is a question of prioritization. Should it be a system of first come, first served? Should it be based on the developing status of the country? And I think it's also important to note that the prioritization comes with a time-sensitive commitment to a case. The organization of the defense, for example, is very important, and there may be procedural deadlines. So there will be a point where there's not going to be a possibility of dropping out of a case. So it's important to take into account when thinking of prioritization that once a decision is made, if the center were to take on management of disputes, for example, there will be a point of no return, because it can't be dropped out in the middle of the case. When we think about other potential beneficiaries, certain possibilities come up. It could be claimants or respondents in state-to-state dispute resolution mechanisms. And this is important to think about also in terms of funding. Because, for example, would a state accept to fund the legal defense of a case against them? Given that state-to-state disputes could have a very intense political element, this is something to think about. Another potential beneficiary is non-disputing parties and advisory in terms of the submissions that they could make if the underlying treaty allows for it. This is, I think, very interesting, and this could be linked to capacity building in the negotiation of investment treaties. And finally, another potential beneficiary is amicus briefs. But this, I think, could also be a sensitive issue if the funding comes from states, for example, and there is different views on the merits position in question. And finally, I would also like to touch on the possibility of having small and medium-sized enterprises as potential beneficiaries of an advisory center. If included, I think the study correctly identifies that they would probably only be able to access certain services, like capacity building, but probably not defense of claims. And this is because there are a lot of issues to be considered here, and I would like to briefly comment on some of them. First of all, we would need to think about which investors could access this help. Is it only those without funds? How do we determine that they have funds to contribute to the case or not? And what happens if it's a person instead of small or medium-sized enterprises? Would they be included in the possibility of using the center or not? Another important question is the issue of ISDS as a last resort mechanism. And I think it's important to ask the question, do we want to encourage the use of ISDS instead of local courts when thinking about small and medium-sized enterprises? They could encounter problems that would likely be able to solve in local courts. Would they encounter problems that justify international arbitration? I think that's another interesting question. There's of course the issue of possible conflict of interest and stakeholder tensions. It could cause serious problems, but this depends to some degree on the services to be provided. But if, for example, the advisory center decides to include legal representation in disputes, there are a number of questions that come to mind regarding conflict of interest. For example, if the center decides to represent a state in a case, it would most likely have access to internal documentation. The center would have access to internal procedures and how the decision-making process works, and probably access to confidential information in that regard. Could the center then advise an investor? I think that raises some important questions. Also, if an investor sues a state and uses the center for legal advice, does that mean then that that state is prevented from that point on from benefiting from the center? And if so, I think we need to ask the question of whether that could be used as a tactic to prevent access to certain states to the advisory center. These are all questions that come up if small and medium-sized enterprises or any other type of investor is included in the services that the center would provide. There are, of course, also political issues and issues of accountability. And this goes back to the question of, do states want to fund claims against themselves? And can this be properly explained to the public? And finally, there's also the issue of defining what small and medium-sized enterprises are and their corporate structure. SMEs have different criteria in each country, and what qualifies as small and medium-sized enterprises in, for example, developed countries may not qualify as such in developing ones. So where is the line drawn? Considering also that there are countries that have a profile of exporting capital and countries of importing capital. Complexly corporate structures also raise a question of making a definition in that sense. This could make that of that much more complicated. So these are all complex issues. I wanted to outline some of them, some of the main points that the scoping study touches on related to potential beneficiaries, raise these important questions, I think, that we will have in discussing these complex issues. But I do want to point out and commend CCSI, because I think the scoping study is a great starting point for having these discussions. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ricardo. And thanks to the 6 presenters and also the chair of the Working Group 3 for their presentations. We now have around 25 minutes for open questions and comments. I've already received 3. And so we'll begin with the first question, which is directed at Ralph van der Beek. It would be helpful, Ralph, if you can expand a little more on the idea of discrete legal assistance. What might that entail, and how can the assistance mechanism provide added value to the existing services already out there? Ralph. That'll be followed by a question from Morocco, which will be taken orally.
Thanks, Malcolm. And thanks for that question. I think, the scoping study identifies a number of things, but one could think of the provision of memos on particular legal issues, so that you, one of the issues that you saw from the presentation is the number of hours spent in investment disputes compared to the number of hours of legal lawyer hours compared to the compared to the WTO cases. And I think you could try to bring down those number of hours, or at least the billable hours of it from law firms, if a center or an assistance mechanism could provide advice on particular sort of legal issues that might even have a broader impact. Also providing access to information, perhaps even providing cheap or no cost access to databases or research facilities or research tools, managing and gathering documentary evidence. Those are legal assistance services that could be provided that would not be, I would say, in any case, that would not have conflict of interest, that would have a real effect or could address some of the needs without some of the other implications. And how could this be of added value? Well, one option could, of course, be to set up some kind of legal assistance or resource clearinghouse, because as was mentioned, there are many types of assistance or support already available, but it is not gathered at one point, so you have to look for it. And therefore, I think there could be added value if you set up something, a clearinghouse that would compile, organize, and disseminate information about what is available, what is out there to relevant government officials. So there are a number of things that we might discuss. Again, I didn't suggest to paint a full picture or in any case limit discussions, but I think it would be a good starting point if we identified some of these potentially low-hanging fruit and build on that. And just quote Carl, let's not make the perfect the enemy of the good. We have to start somewhere, and this might be a proper avenue. Thanks.
Excellent. We now have 2 questions from the representative of Morocco, Zakaria Lagzo, and which I will then translate after he makes his intervention in French. The word is yours.
Bonjour tout le monde. J'espère que vous vous portez bien en ces temps difficiles. Tout d'abord, on exprime notre soutien à la création d'un centre consultatif en tant que composant d'une légitimité, d'une inclusion plus élevée au monde des différents relatifs aux investissements. Actuellement, il n'existe aucune institution qui fournit une assistance pour la représentation des personnes interrogées dans les différentes internations en matière d'investissement. Les pays en développement sont laissés à eux-mêmes. Et comme les intervenants ont dit, parmi les compétences du centre consultatif, ce centre devrait être représenté avec les avocats des États défendeurs, les pays en développement dans les différentes internationaux en matière d'investissement. Et la préparation immédiate de ces différends. Deuxièmement, aider les pays en développement en raison de l'augmentation des coûts des différends relatifs aux investissements. Le Maroc a des petits soucis, notamment sur le fardeau financier que l'État devrait supporter résultant de son recours au service de ce centre. Et pour mes questions qui concernent le centre, j'ai deux petites questions. La première concerne est comme suit. Quelle est la nature juridique de la relation entre le pays bénéficiaire des services et le centre? La deuxième question, quelles sont les limites de la responsabilité de ce centre envers le pays bénéficiaire de ces services? Et merci.
Merci, and thank you very much to the representative from the government of Morocco. Two very concrete questions. What is the formal legal relationship between the beneficiary state and the advisory centre? And secondly, what are the limits in terms of liability of the centre towards the beneficiary country? So I'm wondering if any of our 6 or 7 speakers would like to answer those two questions. Any volunteers?
Well,
yeah,
Carl here. I understood the question differently, but if you have the authoritative translation, then that may be it. I understood what would be the relationship between the donors and the center in terms of also the center being responsive or responsible to the donors. Now, if that's and that's certainly an issue, huh? Because the obvious implication is that who provide the money might influence what cases are being taken and what the outcome is. And I think there, the model of the WTO Advisory Center is a very good one in the sense of making sure that you have a broad representation of not only donors, but also beneficiaries in running overall the center and providing guidance. And I certainly raised that question in various conversations with the center from early on, with the advisory center on WTO law from early on. And certainly the impression I have received is that at least in that case, the center was entirely independent and was also perceived by the beneficiaries as being independent. But I might not have answered, the question as you reformulated it.
I mean, it's certainly an issue in terms of the donors, and Ricardo also raised that in his intervention. As I understand the question, it was specifically on the beneficiary state that receives the benefits or the advice or assistance from the centre. What would be the formal legal relationship between them? And what would be the limits of the liability of the centre towards the beneficiary country if something goes wrong, for example, in the provision of legal assistance?
Malcolm, maybe I could jump in quickly. I'm not sure if this is the exact, we didn't go into the exact legal structure and legal liability in our study as to what the contractual relationship would be in the terms of representation. But one thing that was brought up are the different ways in which the ACWL will provide advice and where they will not touch. So for example, the ACWL will provide legal advice, they won't provide policy advice. And a couple of people who we worked with or spoke with, both involved with the ACWL and investment law, thought that that is a difficult question in trade law and potentially a more difficult question in investment law. So where and how a center might provide assistance would be a question to be discussed, I think, and where and how those legal relationships would flow also be a question for the working group.
Thanks very much, Brooke. If any of the other delegations want to come in, they're welcome to. But I have, just let me know on the chat function. Charles.
A contractual relationship with the countries, and the countries have a contractual relationship with the expert of the legal counsel that provides advice services. Now, so that we don't get caught in some of the problems you're talking about, the ALSS staff don't involve themselves too much in the provision of the advisory services, but mainly act as facilitators of the provision of the advice. Now, we expect or we require, based on the agreements we have amongst the parties, that the law firm's insurance is at a level that is commensurate with when things go wrong, that can be called on by the states. So that's basically how we skirted that issue.
Thanks very much, Charles. And it's good that you also took the word because there's also two questions for you which have come in from Roberto Flores. Firstly, how do you measure the level of success of the African legal facility? And secondly, what are its perspectives for the near future concerning the scope of its activities? So I hope you got those two questions, Charles.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. It's one that exercises our minds all the time. It's all hard to define the place or the contribution of legal advice in a PPP project or an oil and gas project or a mining project. You know, that's hard. But I feel, at least for arbitration, that could be more direct because you can see a direct correlation between the advice that is provided and an outcome. You know, with respect to, if you can remind me of the second question, please.
The second question, let me go. Sorry. The second question is, what are the facility's perspectives for the near future concerning the scope of its activities?
So maybe related to that is the issue of funding. What the member countries, the regional member countries have agreed in a meeting we had recently is to contribute to the financial resources of the facility. So that gives us the opportunity to be able to advance, to expand on the areas we are working on, and also expand into other areas that are relevant to them. You know, because we do get requests from them on arbitration. We have hesitated to do that because, as you all know, it can be expensive, more expensive than some of the commitments we have. Our interventions can be involve as little as $5,000 US to about $2 or $3 million, but the impact is more direct and over a certain period of time. Arbitration can go on for a long time, and within that period, you know, that could be an uncertainty. So we are reluctant to be involved unless there is a framework within which it can be done, where the resources are available. We can identify the specific experts that can provide it. But our mandate basically is encompasses arbitration to the extent related to commercial transactions, which is our original mandate.
Excellent, thanks, Charles. I have two more questions here. The first I've sent to the representative of Thailand concerning mediation, so if you could read that question. But before that, I'll give the word to Marianne Caldas from the Egyptian delegation.
Hi, good evening and good afternoon to everyone. Just for the questions for Ricardo. And Mr. Ricardo, I would like to ask about the capacity building. You said that the capacity building, if I understood well, will be like limited to the knowledge sharing. So what about the idea also of convening the other members? Like the idea of convening so that we like create a kind of a bank where like successes and failures are shared. Like, because those resources are maybe dispersed everywhere and it's not easy for countries to assess them. Can we consider also this idea, or you would like more to limit it to the sharing of knowledge, like for every case particularly? Thank you.
Ricardo, do you want to answer that question?
Yes, happy to. I think it's a very good question and it raises very important points. I don't think it should be limited to case by case. And I can share from a personal point of view, I preside the commission that handles investment disputes for the Republic of Peru. That's the internal system Peru has had in place for many years, thankfully with good results so far. And I have to tell you that one of the most enriching experiences we've had is when we've had the opportunity to sit down with other government representatives, with other legal teams, and share points of view. For example, this happened for us in Ecuador a few years ago. I think it was in 2012. There was a meeting, a regional meeting of legal defense teams from each state. And it really helped us because we were struggling with certain issues, and by discussing them with other legal teams, we were able to identify where we had opportunities to improve what we were doing, but we were also able to identify common problems to all states. There are certain issues, I think, that we are not going to be able to overcome because they come from the nature of the organization and structure of the state. And knowing that is very important so that you can focus your efforts and your internal organization to the areas where you can improve that aspect of the state's defense. I also think it's very useful if states talk between each other and share common experiences of profile arbitrators, of procedural issues they have encountered, how they handled, for example, frivolous claims. I think those are all very useful experiences, and it can be very useful, especially for states who have had the fortune of not facing too many claims, to gain from the experience of countries that have, so that they can be better prepared and there will not be repeated mistakes on that sense. So I think it's a crucial element, and I think it's something that if an advisory center is created, it's something that should definitely be on the table. The possibility of having a permanent body of discussion and to share experiences, I think it's something all states could benefit from.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ricardo. Charlie, do you want to briefly answer the question on mediation?
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I have a question. It says, regarding mediation, since the initiators of the ISDS litigation are usually investors, what are the speakers' thoughts about methods to compel investors other than governments, which the representation was focused, the presentation was focused on, to use mediation in the framework of the advisory center. Well, from my own experience in dealing with disputes, I find that actually the investors are quite keen to use mediation because investors are very time sensitive and they're very money sensitive. So anything that gets the dispute resolved quickly and cheaply and on the terms that are acceptable to them, I think that's actually what automatically attracts the investor to take that option. So in terms of the advisory center, if that could help the government to enter the process of mediation more efficiently and better advised, I think it benefits both sides.
Thanks very much, Charlie. Final question to Carl. Would the Advisory Centre also be able to advise on state contracts, not only treaties, given that often the problems and disputes stem from them, or provide a platform to sharing experience of contracts, for example, in the water or land sectors?
It's clear that contracts are very often the source for international investment disputes. In fact, in the case of ICSID, I think a quarter of all disputes are based, a substantial number of disputes are based on contracts. My answer would be that is not really necessary because you have at least 3 institutions that already do that. You have the International Senior Lawyer Project, which is doing that. You have the African Legal Support Facility, which is actually focused, as far as I understand, precisely on this type of support. And you have CONEX, a support unit established by the German government. And they specifically provide free multidisciplinary advice to governments negotiating contracts, although, of course, they are, except for the African Legal Support Facility, they are not necessarily involved in any disputes arising out of contracts. But if there are disputes arising out of contracts and potentially become or are becoming ISDS cases, I would definitely say a center should provide assistance in those cases as well.
Thanks very much, Carl. And I'm conscious that we've now used up our 2 hours and you haven't had your consultation break as normal, although it's possible to take a consultation break by stopping your video. But on behalf of the Academic Forum, it's been a pleasure to host this meeting with the UNCITRAL Secretariat, and I'd like to now hand it over to Judith Kneiper from the UNCITRAL Secretariat, who will give some closing words on behalf of the Secretary and Jubin.
Still muted?
You're fine,
now,
we hear you. Yeah.
That's perfect. Yes, I would like to thank you also in the name of the Secretariat. This webinar was a very first experience, and you may believe it or not, it was planned before the COVID-19 outbreak. It's one of the very rare events that we did not have to postpone. So the idea of the seminar was meant to be informative, which is why we had all these presentations on the one hand, and on the other hand, to gather information. And I'm really sorry that we had to cut the questions short, because it would have been good for us to continue the discussion, to be able to gather more information on the issues we need to consider further. In any case, we would like to thank you for your participation, for overcoming technical hurdles, especially at the beginning. Some of you had difficulties in entering the webinar with the link, so I hope we will improve that for the second seminar, which will take place after tomorrow. We had some small issues with the internet connection, which we also overcame. But what was shown is that our expectations were largely met. We were betting that we would have between 50 and 100 participants, and we had between 150 and 155. So I think that's a very good outcome, and it shows that this should not be the last webinar. As I said, the second aspect of this webinar was to gather information, and in that context, I would have another request for you, and this is that you fill out the questionnaire which is on our website on the Advisory Center. It's an online questionnaire, it's quite quick to answer to it, but it would really help us gather information from the delegations, from the observers, to be able to further gather the necessary information and to prepare the next round of discussion. Finalement, je tiens à remercier tous les participants francophones qui ont dû suivre la traduction par écrit. Je suis vraiment désolée, mais on n'a pas réussi à surmonter les difficultés techniques. Et pour cela, nous avons improvisé un peu avec la traduction dans le chat. Ce n'était pas idéal, mais j'espère que vous avez quand même pu suivre. En tout cas, je vous souhaite un très bon après-midi et j'espère vous revoir bientôt, peut-être déjà le 23 avril pour notre prochain webinaire du groupe de travail 3. Et surtout, bonne santé. This is, of course, true for all the others as well. Stay healthy. Have a very good morning, afternoon, night, depending on the time zone you are located in. And I wish to see you very soon for our next webinar, which is scheduled to take place on the 23rd of April, which means after tomorrow, same time, 2 p.m. Vienna time, and which deals with the multilateral instrument in ISDS reform. Thank you very much. And I don't have to wish you a good travel home because this is already done. So hope to see you very soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judith, and thanks to everybody for participating.
Bye-bye.
And we'll see you on Thursday.